Imagine waking up inside a structure that looks like it belongs on the surface of Mars, curved walls wrapping around you, a single round window catching the first light of morning, and a door with a lock that only you have the key to. The whole thing costs less than a used Honda Civic. Now imagine that 3 weeks ago you were sleeping on a park bench in 40-degree rain. That is the reality for a growing number of Americans living inside dome homes built by volunteers, veterans, and ordinary people who got tired of waiting for the government to figure it out. And what is happening inside those domes is far more complicated, far more human, and honestly far more interesting than the price tag suggests. The scale of the problem. Here's the number that should make every American stop and sit with it for a moment. 745,000. That is how many people the federal government counted as homeless on a single night in January of 2025. Nearly 150,000 of them were children, kids going to school from shelter beds, from car back seats, from the floors of relatives who barely have room for themselves. And here is the other number, the one that should make you put your phone down and stare at the ceiling. The United States has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on homelessness programs since the 1980s. Hundreds of billions, with a B. And on a January night in 2025, 750,000 people still had nowhere to sleep. That is not a funding problem. Not entirely. It is a results problem, a speed problem, a bureaucracy problem. Cities take years to permit new shelters. Construction costs for traditional, affordable housing have exploded past $300,000 per unit in expensive markets. Los Angeles, a city that has become almost synonymous with the American homelessness crisis, spent roughly $130,000 per unit in one of its own tiny home programs. And even that, by government standards, was considered fast and cheap. Meanwhile, a volunteer crew in Colorado can raise a geodesic dome on a gravel pad in a single afternoon for under $2,000 in materials. Something is not adding up, and people across the country have noticed. What even is a dome home? Before we go any further, we should probably address the elephant in the room, or rather the geodesic sphere in the room. Because when most people hear the words dome home, they picture one of two things: either a futuristic science fiction habitat from a movie where humans have colonized a frozen planet, or something a very enthusiastic hippie built in the woods in 1973 that smells like patchouli and bad decisions. Neither image is wrong, exactly, but neither one tells the real story. The geodesic dome was invented and popularized by an American architect and designer named Buckminster Fuller, who most people called Bucky because Buckminster is a lot to carry around. Fuller spent decades obsessed with a single question: how do you build the strongest possible structure using the least possible material? His answer, arrived at through geometry rather than intuition, was the dome. A sphere-based structure made from interlocking triangles that distribute stress so evenly across its surface that the whole becomes dramatically stronger than the sum of its parts. Fuller first built a large-scale geodesic dome in 1949. By the 1960s, the design had escaped the world of architecture and wandered directly into the counterculture. Communities of young Americans built dome villages in the deserts of New Mexico and the forests of Vermont. Drop City in Colorado, founded in 1965, was one of the first and most famous. People built domes from salvaged car rooftops. They heated them with wood stoves. They lived in them year-round. Most of those communes eventually collapsed, for reasons that had nothing to do with the domes themselves and everything to do with the human beings inside them. But the structural principles that Bucky Fuller worked out in the late 1940s never stopped being true. A geodesic dome is one of the most efficient shapes in construction. It encloses more volume per square foot of surface area than any other form. It is inherently wind resistant because there are no flat surfaces for wind to push against. It sheds snow and rain naturally. And because the triangular panels are prefabricated and lightweight, a small group of people with no heavy equipment can assemble one in hours. That last part is what caught the attention of homeless housing advocates starting in the early 2010s. Because when you are trying to put a roof over someone's head tonight, not in 3 years, hours matters a lot more than months. The $2,000 build, what you actually get. So what does $2,000 actually get you? Let's be specific, because vague numbers in housing conversations are how people end up confused and politicians end up underfunded. A basic geodesic dome shelter of the type being built for homeless communities typically measures between 14 and 16 feet in diameter. That gives you roughly 150 to 200 square feet of interior floor space, which, for context, is about the size of a large walk-in closet in a luxury apartment. Or, roughly twice the size of a New York City bathroom, which some people pay $3,000 a month to live next to. The panels are usually made from one of three materials depending on the builder and the climate. Structural insulated panels, which are a foam core sandwiched between two rigid boards, offer the best insulation but cost more. Plywood panels covered with a weatherproof membrane are cheaper and still highly effective. Some newer builds use recycled plastic composite panels that are nearly indestructible and require almost no maintenance. The frame is typically steel conduit or aluminum, bolted together at connector hubs that hold the triangular geometry in place. The whole frame can be assembled by a crew of 4 volunteers who have never built anything before. Organizations that do this regularly have gotten assembly time down to under 4 hours for the shell alone. Inside, a finished dome built for homeless housing typically includes a locking door, 1 or 2 windows, basic electrical wiring connected to either a community power supply or a small solar panel, a compact heating unit, and enough floor space for a sleeping area, a small storage section, and a chair. Some builds include a lofted sleeping platform that frees up the lower level for living space, which is a clever solution to the square footage problem. Nothing clever about the problem itself, but the solution is genuinely smart. The $2,000 figure covers materials. Volunteer labor, which is how most of these get built, is not counted in that number. And honestly, the volunteer labor is half the story. Retired contractors, church groups, college engineering students who want to build something real for once instead of a model bridge made of popsicle sticks, high school shop classes, veterans organizations. The people swinging the hammers come from everywhere, and they show up week after week because building something you can point to and say a person sleeps safely inside, that tonight turns out to be one of the most satisfying things a human being can do on a Saturday morning. What it's really like to live inside one now. What is it actually like to live inside one? The architectural renderings are not going to tell you. The renderings show warm lighting and a neatly made bed and inevitably a small plant on the windowsill. Plants always make it into the renderings. The reality is more complicated. The first thing people notice is the sound. Curved walls do not bounce noise the way flat parallel walls do, so the interior is quieter than you would expect. Rain on the dome sounds like rain on a drum, which some residents find deeply soothing and others find absolutely maddening. There is no neutral position on rain hitting a curved roof at 2 in the morning. You are going to have feelings about it. The light surprises people too. A single window distributes natural light across curved walls in a way that feels warmer and more even than a rectangular room. Residents describe it as feeling less like a box and more like a space, which sounds like a small thing until you remember that the alternative was a tent or a doorway or nothing. Temperature management is where the dome genuinely earns its reputation. A small heater brings the interior to sleeping temperature within 20 minutes on a cold night. Summer requires a roof vent at the apex to push hot air out through convection, the same principle as a chimney, pulling cooler air in through the door and windows. But the thing that stays with you, the thing the renderings definitely cannot capture, is what Raymond said after his first night in a dome village in Sacramento. He had spent 4 years unsheltered. He said he sat next to the door for an hour, just opening and closing it, because he had forgotten he was allowed to decide. The community's doing this right. Across the country, a handful of organizations have moved beyond building individual domes and into building entire communities of them. And the difference between a single dome dropped on a vacant lot and a thoughtfully designed dome village turns out to be enormous. Homes on the Range, based in Colorado, has built dome communities that include shared kitchen facilities, bathroom and shower trailers, a community garden, on-site case management, and a laundry area. The domes themselves are arranged in a circular pattern which, given that they are domes, feels either intentional or inevitable. Probably both. Residents share common space during the day and retreat to their individual units at night, which strikes what housing advocates call the balance between community and privacy that traditional congregate shelters almost never get right. In California, an organization called Dome Village which operated in Los Angeles in the early 2000s, was one of the first large-scale experiments in this model. 20 dome structures housed up to 30 residents at a time on a privately owned lot near downtown. It ran for over a decade before the landowner reclaimed the property. But in that decade, it produced outcomes that surprised even its critics. Residents accessed health services, substance abuse treatment, and job placement at rates significantly higher than residents of traditional emergency shelters. Case managers who worked there said the privacy of the individual dome, the fact that residents had their own space to return to each night, changed the entire dynamic of the support relationship. People are more willing to work on hard things when they have somewhere safe to process it afterward. In Oregon, the Opportunity Village model in Eugene has used small individual shelters, including dome-style units arranged around shared community infrastructure since 2013. Their outcomes data has been cited in housing policy conversations across the country. Over 2/3 of residents who enter Opportunity Village transition to more stable housing within 18 months. Compare that to the national average for congregate emergency shelters, where long-term housing placement rates hover between 25 and 40%, and you start to understand why people are paying attention. Washington State has seen a similar model take hold through organizations like Othello Village in Seattle, which combines small individual shelter units with intensive wraparound services. The pattern repeats everywhere the model has been given a real chance. Smaller individual spaces plus shared community infrastructure plus consistent case management equals better outcomes than large congregate shelters at a fraction of the construction cost and in a fraction of the time. The people inside the domes. But the structure is only the beginning of the story. Because the people living inside these domes are not statistics or policy problems. They are people with histories that most of us would find unrecognizable and a few of us would find uncomfortably familiar. Marcus is a 54-year-old Army veteran who served 2 tours in the Gulf region in the 1990s. He came home with a traumatic brain injury that went undiagnosed for 8 years. By the time it was identified, he had lost his marriage, his apartment, and most of his working memory for names and dates. He spent 3 years living in his truck in Colorado before it was repossessed. He entered a dome village in the Denver area 18 months ago. He says the dome saved his life. He does not mean that dramatically. He means it the way a mechanic means it when they say a part saved an engine. Precisely. Clinically. He says the quiet inside the dome allowed him to sleep through the night for the first time since his deployment. He says his brain works better when he is not woken up 15 times a night by the sounds of a crowded shelter. He has been working with a VA case manager. He is on a waiting list for permanent supported housing. He volunteers twice a week, helping build new dome units for the organization. Jennifer is 38 years old. She aged out of the foster care system in Ohio at 18 with 2 garbage bags of belongings and a list of resources that were mostly already closed or full. She spent her 20s cycling in and out of low-wage jobs and unstable housing situations. A relationship that turned violent left her with a broken wrist, a restraining order, and no place to go. She entered a dome village in Columbus last year. She says the thing nobody tells you about losing your housing is that you also lose your ability to plan. Not your desire to plan. Your ability. When you do not know where you are sleeping tomorrow, your brain stops being capable of thinking about next month. She says the dome gave her back next month. She is taking an online bookkeeping course. She has a savings account with $240 in it. She knows exactly how much is in it because she checks it every morning. Demetrius is 26. He was released from a correctional facility in Georgia 14 months ago after serving 3 years for a nonviolent drug offense. He had nowhere to go. His family had moved. His record made it nearly impossible to find an apartment. A dome village outside Atlanta was the first stable place he slept after his release. He says he was afraid the other residents would judge him for his record. Instead, a 60-year-old woman who had been in the dome community for 4 months brought him a bowl of soup his first night and told him to rest. He has not stopped thinking about that soup. He has a job now at a warehouse outside the city. He starts at 5 in the morning, which means he is up at 3:45, which means the dome's quiet interior is not optional for him. It is operationally necessary. He is saving for a deposit on an apartment. He thinks he will have it by spring. What the government thinks about all of this. Of course, the government has thoughts about all of this. The government always has thoughts. Whether those thoughts translate into action in under a decade is a different question. Zoning laws in most American cities were written decades ago, when the concept of a geodesic dome as a permanent or semi-permanent residence would have been considered either visionary or insane, depending on who you asked. Most municipal codes do not have a category for dome structures at all, which means that when a nonprofit tries to site a dome village, the permit process often requires navigating 3 or 4 separate regulatory frameworks simultaneously, none of which were designed with this use case in mind. In some cities, a volunteer crew can raise a complete dome in 4 hours. The permit to place that dome legally on a piece of land can take 18 months, occasionally longer. There is something almost cosmically absurd about that math, and yet it is the reality that organizations working in this space run into constantly. Los Angeles, which by this point has tried approximately everything except actually solving the problem, has had a complicated relationship with dome and micro-shelter models. The city has alternated between embracing small-scale shelter innovation and sending sanitation crews to dismantle it, sometimes within the same budget cycle. The same city government that spent years trying to pass a nearly $2 billion homelessness plan that largely stalled has also in more recent years begun contracting with organizations that build small individual shelter units at dramatically lower cost per bed. Some cities have gotten it right. Eugene, Oregon, passed municipal code amendments specifically to accommodate small shelter villages. Olympia, Washington created a designated area for sanctioned tiny shelter communities with city-provided utilities. Austin, Texas approved a small-scale shelter village model that includes dome-style units as part of its broader homelessness response strategy. The pattern in cities that have made progress is consistent. Local government stops trying to solve homelessness with one enormous program and starts treating it like the distributed, varied, urgent crisis that it actually is. They stop asking, how do we build the perfect permanent solution, and start asking, how do we get this specific person off the street tonight, and then work forward from there. It sounds simple. It is apparently extremely difficult. Does it actually work? The numbers. So does it actually work? Beyond the individual stories, beyond the feel-good headlines, what do the numbers say? The honest answer is that the data is still developing because dome villages as a scaled model are still relatively new. But what exists is encouraging in a way that the data on traditional shelter systems, frankly, is not. In communities where dome villages have been paired with consistent wraparound services, meaning case management, mental health support, substance use treatment when needed, job placement, and a real pathway to permanent housing, transition rates to stable housing range from 55 to over 70% within 18 months. The Opportunity Village model in Eugene has documented these outcomes over more than a decade. The Veterans Community Project in Kansas City, which uses small individual home units rather than domes specifically but follows the same design philosophy, has documented veteran housing placement rates that helped contribute to a 55% decline in veteran homelessness nationally since 2010. The cost comparison is even more striking. A dome village serving 30 residents can be built from the ground up, including shared infrastructure, landscaping, utility connections, and all 30 individual dome units, for between $100,000 and $500,000, depending on location and amenities. A traditional emergency shelter serving 30 people requires a building that meets commercial construction codes, a process that in most American cities costs millions of dollars and takes years. Put that another way. For the cost of one traditional emergency shelter bed in Los Angeles, you could build somewhere between 2 and 8 complete dome units. Units that give residents private space, a locking door, and the psychological foundation from which actual recovery becomes possible. The dollar per outcome math is not close. The critics aren't entirely wrong. Now here is the part where we have to be honest, because one of the things that separates a useful conversation about homelessness from a feel-good story that leaves people with false comfort is honesty about limitations. And dome homes have real limitations. They are not permanent structures. A well-built dome unit with quality panels can last 10 to 15 years with proper maintenance, but it is not a house. It does not appreciate in value, it does not build equity, it does not solve the underlying shortage of affordable permanent housing that is the actual root cause of most of the homelessness crisis in expensive American cities. Weather is a real variable. Dome communities in climates with heavy snow need reinforced panel ratings and apex venting designed for load-bearing situations. Dome communities and hurricane zones need anchoring systems that add cost and complexity. The basic $2,000 structure is designed for moderate climates. Adapting it for extreme conditions costs more and requires more expertise. Privacy inside a dome village is better than a congregate shelter, but it is still a community setting. Residents share bathrooms, kitchens, and common areas. For some people, especially those with significant trauma histories, that shared infrastructure remains a barrier to feeling fully safe. The best dome village operators know this and invest heavily in community standards, conflict resolution processes, and individualized support. The organizations that treat the dome as the complete solution, rather than as the foundation of a larger support system, consistently produce worse outcomes. And then there is the permanence question that critics raise most often. Is a dome village in a vacant lot a solution or a more comfortable version of the same inadequate response? It is a fair question. The honest answer is that it is both, depending on what comes next. A dome village with a genuine pathway to permanent housing is a solution. A dome village that warehouses people indefinitely without forward movement is a better-looking version of the same failure. The difference is almost never the dome, it is the case manager on the other side of the door. Here is where this is heading, and it is actually heading somewhere. New materials are entering the dome construction space that are changing the cost and durability calculation. Recycled plastic composite panels made from post-consumer waste are being tested by several organizations, and early results suggest a lifespan of 20+ years at a cost per unit comparable to the current $2,000 standard. Modular dome designs that can be disassembled, moved, and reassembled as land availability changes are being refined. Solar integration is becoming standard rather than optional in newer builds. Some organizations are experimenting with connecting dome units to graywater recycling systems that dramatically reduce their utility costs. The state of California, which contains more than 1/5 of the entire national homeless population, has been watching the small shelter model closely after years of watching large-scale programs produce underwhelming results. Oregon has become something like a national laboratory for alternative shelter models. Colorado, Washington, Texas, and Georgia all have active dome village projects with documented outcomes that are attracting attention from municipal housing departments that have exhausted their faith in conventional approaches. None of this means the dome is the answer. Housing is complicated, and anyone who tells you any single design is the answer is probably trying to sell you something. But what the dome represents, what it keeps demonstrating in city after city, is a principle that the American housing system has been slow to accept. People do not need a perfect solution to start rebuilding their lives. They need a place to start. A door that locks, a space that belongs to them, a night of sleep in which nobody asks them to leave. A man named Raymond in Sacramento spent an hour opening and closing a door because he had forgotten that he was allowed to decide. A woman named Gloria in Portland found a word she had lost: private. A veteran named Marcus finally slept through the night. A 26-year-old named Demetrius ate a bowl of soup and felt something he did not have a name for yet, but was starting to recognize. None of those moments happened inside a government program with a 10-year timeline. They happened inside a curved structure made of triangles that cost less than a used couch, built by volunteers on a Saturday morning who wanted to do something real. 745,000 people are outside tonight. Some of them are going to end up inside a dome. And for those people, the dome is not a compromise. It is the beginning of everything that comes after. If this video changed how you see the crisis, subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, the ones happening at the ground level while the committees are still meeting. And click the video on screen right now. What I covered there connects directly to what you just watched. I will see you in that one.